Hello, this is Eric DeCarbonell from MarketSkeptics.com. This video is about something I've been afraid to blog about, the Treasury Department's Exchange Stabilization Fund and its history. The ESF is a super-secret Treasury operation and is the official channel for the Treasury's gold and foreign currency dealings. This means covert operations. The ESF is also virtually free of congressional control and has been used to pay a number of strange activities. It is the largest, most powerful financial agency in the world. Trust me, this won't be boring. Let's begin by reviewing the basics. First, the Exchange Stabilization Fund has been around a long while. It was created by the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 to protect the value of the dollar, and it does this by buying and selling foreign currency. For example, when the US buys $1 billion in March intervention, it is the work of the Treasury's ESF. So the outcome of the inflation versus deflation debate that's been raging over the last few years really depends on this agency that most people have never even heard of. Number 2. ESF operations are conducted through the New York Fed. This means that the New York Fed executes the actual trading, handles the back office documentation, etc. on the ESF's behalf. Basically, the ESF operates from within and controls the New York Fed. Let me give you an example to illustrate this important point. Here's a Wall Street Journal article from 1962. It shows how the New York Fed has been striving to stabilize the dollar as agent for the Exchange Stabilization Fund. In other words, a large part of the New York Fed staff work for the ESF defending the dollar. The New York Fed essentially is the ESF. So when the New York Fed lends $85 billion to AIG, and when New York Fed staff lament the inability to keep Congress in the dark about the details of that bailout, that is the ESF at work. Number 3. The Treasury's ESF controls international finance. What most people don't realize is that the Secretary of the Treasury is the Chief International Monetary Policy Official of the United States, and the ESF helps carry out these responsibilities. What this means is the Fed takes directions from the Treasury Department on international monetary affairs. So in the international arena, the Fed's independence is limited. The Treasury controls international finance, and the Fed does what it's told to do. Chairman Martin, the Fed's longest-serving chairman, confirms that anything done by the Federal Reserve must be coordinated with the Treasury through the Stabilization Fund. The absolutely key point here is that on any international matter, like establishing currency swaps with foreign central banks, bailing out international companies like AIG, and interventions in the currency market, the Treasury is in charge. To understand how important this is, think back to 2008 when McCain enjoyed a 5-point lead over Obama in the polls, and then the New York Fed let Lehman Brothers fail, which almost took down the entire financial system. The market crashed, and overnight the national dialogue turned almost entirely onto the economy. Obama's polling jumped, McCain dropped and never recovered. After the collapse in the fall of 2008, there was nothing the McCain campaign could do to win that election. The ESF's decision to let Lehman Brothers fail gave Obama the presidency. Number 4. The ESF keeps a low profile using the Fed as a front. It's not an accident that most people have never heard of the Exchange Stabilization Fund. The ESF is a slush fund that likes to operate in extreme secrecy. The ESF keeps a low profile by letting the Fed speak on its behalf and using the New York Fed to act on its behalf. The ESF also uses the phrase U.S. monetary authorities to keep its name out of the news. Of course, U.S. monetary authorities means the Federal Reserve and the ESF. So what happens is the Federal Reserve ends up with all the credit and the blame, and the ESF continues operating without anyone knowing it exists. One of the many reasons the ESF keeps a low profile is the fact that it's done a terrible job. Since the ESF was put in charge of defending the dollar's value, the greenback has been on a one-way track to worthlessness. Notice that for the period of time that the Federal Reserve was in charge of defending the dollar, it did its job. The dollar kept its value right up to the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, when all the Fed's powers were transferred to the Treasury's ESF. Hijacking the Fed. To understand how the Treasury took control of the Federal Reserve, we need to look at the congressional hearings held in 1934. The Gold Reserve Act was the most important bill to come before Congress since the Civil War. Because it destroyed America's central bank. It fundamentally shifted responsibility from the Federal Reserve System to the Treasury in the only matters in which the control of the currency and credit really matter. Even before this bill, the Secretary of the Treasury was practically dominating the Fed. The Gold Reserve Act gave the Treasury the means to completely control the Federal Reserve. It gave the Secretary of the Treasury such powers of a permanent nature that he could nullify anything the Federal Reserve did. It nullified, if not scrapped, the Federal Reserve System. If you take away all the Fed's powers and gold, where will the Federal Reserve System stand? It utterly emasculated the fundamental idea of the Federal Reserve banking system. These quotes are not exaggerated. Here's a graph of short-term interest rates over the last 50 years. Now, the Federal Reserve supposedly sets short-term interest rates, right? Well, I've color-coded this graph with all the Secretary of the Treasuries for this time period, and it produces some interesting patterns. Notice how visibly the changes in Secretary of the Treasury affect interest rates, especially the trend in interest rates. Up, down, steady, down, up, steady, up, down, up, down. The Fed's independence is a myth. The Treasury has dominated the Federal Reserve through the ESF. Today, the Federal Reserve is a mere shadow of itself, a mechanism functioning as a clearing agency which has no control over anything important. Taking control of America's gold. Even the question of where the ESF got all its money is embarrassing. After confiscating all the gold in America, the Treasury devalued the dollar, creating a huge capital gain. This profit became the war chest of the Treasury, the Exchange Stabilization Fund. This visual history of the Fed shows how gold holdings were forbidden, then gold was revalued, and the profits put into the Exchange Stabilization Fund. A key point here is that the Treasury's ESF, through confiscation, took control of 3/4 of the world's monetary gold. The ESF was a guaranteed disaster, and people knew it back in 1934. Transferring all this power to a Secretary of the Treasury who has never had any banking experience, and giving the biggest borrower in the world the ability to inflate its debts away, is not smart. If this bill goes through this way, not even the President can control the ensuing inflation. If the stabilization fund should fail, we might be drifting towards a period of extreme inflation. While putting the Treasury in control of monetary policy was bad enough, even worse was the way the ESF was set up. Dictatorial power and no oversight. Section 10 of the Gold Reserve Act states that the sum of $2 billion will be deposited in the ESF under the exclusive control of the Secretary of the Treasury, whose decisions shall be final and not subject to review by any other officer of the United States. Handing that much money to one man is something that should have kept people up at night. The man does not live, never has lived, and never will live, who has the ability to single-handedly manage so large a fund. Furthermore, there was no limit to what the Secretary of the Treasury could do with that money. The bill's wording gave the Treasury unlimited authority to deal in almost anything. Worse still, because the ESF was conceived to operate in secret, Congress decided to never look at what it was doing. Since its creation in 1934, the ESF has operated with no congressional oversight whatsoever. Secrecy about what the government does with people's money is never healthy. The Gold Reserve Act centered in the hands of the Secretary of the Treasury dictatorial powers, far too much power to place in the hands of one man. And, as my great-grandfather Frank Vanderlip states, the Secretary of the Treasury would have a lot of things to do, and power to do them that a banker would not. The ESF begins financing covert operations. It didn't take long for the Treasury to abuse the ESF. In 1940, the Treasury started calling the Stabilization Fund its secret weapon, and the ESF began advancing large sums of money to China, Argentina, and other countries. These loans had nothing to do with stabilization. China needed help holding Japan back, and the handiest place to get the money was the Stabilization Fund. The ESF became America's secret weapon against the Axis during World War II. Not everyone was happy with this development. Most congressmen naively thought that the ESF would defend the dollar, and they were upset. Not that this mattered. The Secretary of the Treasury is under no obligations to comply with the general laws of the United States in handling the Stabilization Fund. Because of this, the ESF has been a source of funds for discretionary executive branch spending, the likes of which Congress has sought to prevent, the Iran-Contra scheme being a recent example. The ESF has a long history of credit operations, and the tables accessible on the Treasury's website give a history of ESF credit arrangements. As you can see, the ESF has been funding covert operations around the world for nearly 80 years. Notice that the 1941 loan to China is not used. In fact, nearly all the ESF's credit arrangements are not used. That's because the $50 million loan to China was closed in the complicated terms of international finance, and the United States lent nothing as far as the stabilization fund is concerned. And the $50 million loan to Argentina isn't even in the list. So what type of covert operations was the stabilization financing? Well, the man managing the operations of the ESF during World War II was Harry Dexter White. White wasn't a normal Treasury employee. He was given large authority in vast and sensitive government areas. White was the official Treasury representative on all kinds of committees. This list shows White's widespread governmental activities outside of the Treasury while he was managing the ESF. Of special note is the OSS Advisory Committee. The famous Office of Strategic Services was the counter-espionage and counter-propaganda agency of the government. It was America's first intelligence agency, a vast and chaotic organization of more than 12,000 people. The OSS carried out espionage and put out black propaganda. Now, black propaganda is nasty stuff, and the OSS concocted some of the blackest propaganda you ever heard, all financed by the Treasury's Stabilization Fund. The ESF designs the world's monetary system. Virtually no one is aware that the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Monetary System are ESF creations. Beginning in 1942, the Treasury began playing around with the idea of setting up an International Monetary Stabilization Fund, and by 1943 it had devised a World Currency Stabilization Program. The Treasury's post-war money plan had two parts. The first part was a $10 billion United Nations Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in other words, the World Bank. The second part was an $8 billion International Stabilization Fund, which people now know as the IMF. The author of both proposals was Harry White, whose plan for the post-war international monetary system was endorsed by the 42 countries attending the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. And with the Bretton Woods Agreement signed, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created. Now, the Harry White who designed the final version of the IMF and World Bank was the same Harry White that was on the OSS Advisory Committee and managed the operations of the ESF. The point here is that White wasn't a banker, an economist, or a monetary expert. He was an ESF spook. His area of expertise was slush funds and financing covert operations. This was not the person you wanted to design the international monetary system. The Bretton Woods system, which made the dollar into the world's reserve currency, was shaped by the Exchange Stabilization Fund. You see, during World War II, White worked on plans for an inter-American bank, the aim of which was to frustrate Nazi penetration of Latin America. In other words, a slush fund, like the ESF, to finance covert operations. The plans for an inter-American bank did not materialize. However, they inspired the creation of the IMF and World Bank. White designed the IMF to operate along ESF lines. The ESF's own money was then transferred to the IMF, to which other countries made their own contributions. Finally, White took control of this giant pile of money by becoming the first head of the IMF. The ESF, through White, created a giant stabilization fund in its own image. The Bretton Woods IMF and World Bank were a camouflage method of lending billions of American dollars abroad. It was called foreign aid, although in some cases the countries involved didn't even know they were receiving any aid. Using these devices for draining savings out of the US, the ESF went wild financing CIA Cold War activities. And the one coordinating all these IMF and World Bank loans was the ESF. The ESF finances covert operations and then gets repaid from the IMF or the World Bank. Like the Gold Reserve Act, Bretton Woods was a guaranteed disaster, which was fiercely opposed by anyone with any banking experience. Bankers had fundamental objections to the Bretton Woods proposals, including their fears about what might happen to the dollar. American bankers were so critical of the Bretton Woods plan that the Treasury had to launch a propaganda campaign to get the agreement signed, and our international banking system was created without the input from real bankers, running the black budget, as is explained in Operation Rollback. The heart and soul of covert operations is the provision of unvouchered funds and the inviolability of such funds from outside inspection. In other words, untraceable, unaccountable cash. The ESF, with its extravagant freedom from scrutiny enshrined in law, was nothing short of ideal for funding secret operations. That's why, after World War II, when U.S. covert operations were transferred to the Office of Policy Coordination, the new head of the OPC, Frank Wisner, turned to the ESF for financing. Wisner's first plan of action, to defeat the Communists in the April 1948 Italian elections, was funded by $10 million provided by the ESF. The millions were delivered to Italian politicians in suitcases filled with cash. So it was a slush fund established to stabilize the dollar that started the United States on the first covert operations of the Cold War. It is important to understand here that the ESF runs the US's black budget. The ESF takes in cash from a variety of sources and then funnels that money to covert operations. Here's an example. In 1941, the War Powers Act authorized the U.S. Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund to serve as a holding pool for captured Nazi valuables. This pool of money became a secret source of financing for U.S. clandestine operations in the early days of the CIA. And that's how the ESF runs the black budget. Sources of ESF cash include the gold confiscated from U.S. citizens, IMF and World Bank loans, money siphoned from the Marshall Plan, appropriations buried in the budgets of other agencies, and income from illicit activities like drug trafficking. All U.S. intelligence agencies have been financed by this cash. The ESF is involved in everything the CIA does. More importantly, the ESF is capable of running its own covert operations. After all, the ESF has the unreviewable authority to engage in covert actions in international finance, and has been funding covert efforts since before the CIA's existence. Consider this: the CIA operates under some legal restrictions. There are no legal restrictions on the ESF. The CIA has been investigated by Congress multiple times. The ESF has never been investigated by Congress. It should be obvious that the nastiest stuff will be done by the ESF itself, and that America's darkest secrets are buried where Congress never looks and never asks questions. The ESF and the CIA go wild fighting the Cold War. To learn about the history of the CIA, I recommend Legacy of Ashes, a book by New York Times reporter Tim Weiner. Weiner has been working on Legacy of Ashes for 20 years. He has read over 50,000 government documents, 2,000 oral histories, and has conducted 300 on-the-record interviews. This is as factual as you can get. Weiner has also won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the intelligence community. Despite the vast resources at its disposal, the CIA has largely been a failure. First, it is no good at espionage. In a typical example, the agency dropped millions of dollars worth of gold bars, arms, two-way radios, and agents into Poland to support a powerful Polish underground movement that didn't exist. 5 years of planning, various agents, and millions of dollars down the drain. On the clandestine side, the human costs were far higher. The CIA has secretly supported fascists, militarists, murderers, death squads, and religious fanatics. The agency's official history could be written in blood, not ink. In Iran, a CIA coup initiated a period of 25 years of repression and torture. In Guatemala, a CIA-organized coup initiated 40 years of military government death squads, torture, disappearances, and mass executions. In Indonesia, it waged a full-scale war against the government, including bombing runs by American pilots. In Laos, the CIA was repeatedly involved in coups and created a clandestine army to overthrow the government. In Ecuador, the CIA ousted President Velasco. In Congo, the CIA installed Mobutu Seko, who ruled with a level of corruption and cruelty that shocked even his CIA handlers. The list goes on. Because the agency operates in secret, most Americans are unaware of the crimes being perpetrated in their names. The deaths from these armed assaults run into the millions. To learn more about this dark history, go to Google Archive News. There has been nothing, no matter how terrible, that the ESF has not been willing to finance. There is unfortunately one area the agency excelled. Through the CIA, the ESF has decades of experience with undermining democracy. In Japan, for example, the CIA entrenched the Liberal Democratic Party in power and turned Japan into a single-party state, which it remains to this day. The other thing the CIA was good at was hiding its own incompetence. Even when the CIA seemed to fail at everything it undertook, the ability to represent failure as success was becoming a CIA tradition. The ESF-CIA set up a worldwide propaganda network. The US engaged in a propaganda war against the Soviet Union, and so it built a worldwide propaganda network, which ranged in importance from Radio Free Europe to a third-string guy in Quito. The network was known to those inside the CIA as Wisner's Wurlitzer, named after Frank Wisner and the Wurlitzer organ. Almost at the push of a button, the Wurlitzer became the means for orchestrating in almost any language anywhere in the world whatever tune the CIA was in the mood to hear. The agency's long-standing relationship with American journalists was first called to public attention in 1973. That led to investigations by 2 congressional committees. Let's look at the final report of one of those committees. What interests us is Part 10 on the domestic impact of CIA operations. The variety of CIA relationships with the US media makes a systematic breakdown almost impossible. The CIA is now using several hundred American academics who write books and other materials for propaganda purposes. In the world of covert propaganda, book publishing activities have a special place. A single book can significantly change the reader's attitude and actions to an extent unmatched by the impact of any other single medium. Well over 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored. I have a particular hatred for the book form of propaganda. If anyone thinks the financial crisis was caused by Wall Street greed, please watch my video on the true cause of the crisis. The danger of CIA propaganda contaminating US media occurs in virtually any instance of propaganda use. In the case of books, substantial fallout in the United States may be a necessary part of the propaganda process. An American that reads one of these books would not know that his thoughts and opinions are being shaped by an agency of the United States government. The CIA failed to reveal the names of propaganda books published since 1967. In fact, the CIA wasn't cooperative in anything with regard to its media relationships. Carl Bernstein from the Watergate scandal explained why in his cover story published in 1977. Because from the CIA's point of view this was the highest and most sensitive covert program of all, the CIA went to extraordinary lengths to hide its media relationships. The CIA persuaded the committee to restrict its inquiry and to deliberately misrepresent the actual scope of the activities in its final report. Obscuring the facts was simple. No mention was made of the 400 summaries. Instead, the report noted blandly that some 50 recent contacts with journalists had been studied, thus conveying the impression that the agency's dealing with the press had been limited to those instances. Even while the Senate Intelligence Committee was holding its hearings, the CIA continued to maintain ties with 75 to 90 journalists of every description. As Bernstein discovered after 6 months of research, more than 400 American journalists have secretly carried out assignments for the CIA. Some of the journalists were Pulitzer Prize winners, distinguished reporters. To a degree never widely suspected, the CIA has concentrated its relationships with journalists in the most prominent sectors of the American press corps. In other words, the big names in news. That means people like Brian Williams and Katie Couric. Go to my entry on the Nightly News for an example on how bad the situation is. In response to Bernstein's article, the New York Times wrote a 3-part series on the CIA's propaganda network, and that was the last we ever heard of the issue. Some interesting things were written in this series. At least 18 American reporters have refused CIA offers, some of which were quite lucrative. At least 22 American news organizations have employed American journalists who were working for the CIA. These include some of the most influential influential news organizations in America. Major outlets like Time, Newsweek, CBC News, and the Times itself were the most extensively used. The Times unearthed several occasions where the CIA had interfered with the paper's reporting, including in 1954 when the CIA overthrew the government of Mexico, and a Times reporter was getting too close to discovering its role. The New York Times also shows how the CIA suppresses undesired information. The CIA seriously considered a plan to buy up the entire first printing of a book to keep it from the public view. When that didn't work, a propaganda campaign was initiated to encourage reviewers to denigrate the book. A large part of the CIA's effort at domestic censorship was aimed at news accounts of its own operations. Finally, take a look at the CIA Report on Openness from 1992, which shows that the Wurlitzer is alive and well. The CIA's Public Affairs Office now has relationships with reporters from every major newswire service, newspaper, newsweekly, and television network in the nation. In many instances, the CIA has persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold, or even scrap stories. This has helped the agency change some intelligence failure stories into intelligence success stories. The ESF's twisted logic. Consider this. First, the Fed has established currency swaps on the ESF's behalf. Swaps are a type of derivative. Second, the ESF intervenes mainly in the forward market through the New York Fed. Forwards are also derivatives. Now, on the New York Fed's website it states, the Fed historically has not engaged in forward or other derivative transactions. This lie is produced by the ESF's twisted logic. You see, anything the Fed does on the ESF's behalf doesn't officially happen. This same logic applies to other agencies. For example, the CIA doesn't need to tell Congress about anything funded directly by the ESF. Now take this twisted logic in the context of journalists paid by the CIA. In 1976, CIA announced it would no longer enter into paid relationships with journalists. But what about the ESF? Well, in 1971, the ESF had 300 people on a payroll of 5 million. And in 1976, the ESF had 500 people on a payroll of 10 million. That's quite a big jump, isn't it? This propaganda network has always been financed by the ESF. Taking the CIA out of the equation doesn't change much. The ESF spends the entire US gold reserves. What happens when you give people who believe they have a self-appointed mission of world-shaking importance all control over US gold reserves? Well, they knew the answer to this question back in 1939. Senator Glass, a critic of the ESF, explains what the government would do. You would just go ahead and spend that money, and then borrow more on top of it. To demonstrate what would happen to the dollar, he held up a bundle of German marks. You have to understand that owning gold was only illegal for Americans. Foreigners were not prohibited from asking for, receiving, and owning gold instead of holding on to dollars. So when the ESF delivered suitcases filled with cash to foreign politicians, it was spending America's gold. This was a big deal. Because the supply of gold is limited, its value is steady over long periods of time. On the other hand, the supply of paper currencies, like the dollar, is not limited, so they lose value against gold, or crash completely. By 1956, America's gold hoard was too small to back the dollar. The ESF was spending money as though the sky was the limit. Using the IMF and the World Bank, the ESF went wild financing CIA Cold War activity. This massive spending turned the balance of payments negative. These deficits were badly damaging the dollar. Other countries were building up claims against US gold. The outcome of the ESF's foreign aid was obvious. By 1960, the US gold supply was down to 18 billion against 19 billion in foreign claims. The United States was essentially broke. The gold outflow begins. The gold outflow began in 1958. America's foreign aid and military security programs started the gold trickling outwards. It swelled to almost torrential proportions in 1960. The situation had begun to cause panic. Confidence in the greenback was failing. The dollar, the U.S. economy, and the world monetary system were in danger of collapsing. This was a problem. You see, on the day the dollar crashes, the entire world will focus on the agency that was supposed to protect its value. How do you think Americans, with their retirement savings wiped out, living through the Second Great Depression, would feel about Project Artichoke, a 15-year, multi-billion-dollar search for ways to control the human mind? I think the American people would be quite angry about how the ESF wasted the US's monetary wealth, and a lot of people would end up in jail for a very long time. So people at the Treasury started defending the dollar like their lives depended on it, because they did.